What's up, guys? Welcome back to the caves, and today we are going back to the class build garage to talk about an insanely fun and effective scout build that combines crowd control and single target focus into a delicious soup of scout goodness and yummy damage. See, this is why I need a script. This is why I need to script things out. This is what happens when I try to wing it. But too late, we're already here, so let's just keep going. Anyway, this build is one that I have loved putting together, and it is great for anyone who wants to put together a build for Scout that is good in pretty much any situation you can think of. So if you guys are ready, let's go over what name should I give this build? The AI Soldier, AI Warrior, the AI Mercenary build for the Scout class in DeepRockGalactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another upload. So this build is one that, as I said in the beginning, mixes both single target damage and crowd control in a very good package, and is good for people who don't necessarily know how to build the Scout too well, as it gives you a lot of coverage to be able to do many different things in good ways. It focuses on single target damage using our GK2 assault rifle with its AI stability overclock, and you get to deal with crowds in a very fun way by using the Nishanka Bolt Shark crossbow with the Broadkin bolts overclock. This build is not super duper complex, but there are some interesting strategies that you kind of need to know before going into it, as there are a lot of combinations that work between all aspects of the build that help it shine in a very good way. You'll be using all aspects of your setup, from your primary and your secondary to your grenades to basically everything to use this build to its full effectiveness. It also makes the build incredibly fun and active, and basically feels like you're never not doing anything, and is good for people who feel as though whenever they make a certain build, that one weapon seems to be used more than the other, so they don't really have a chance to use their entire kit. There's not really going to be anything that you're not going to be able to take out, at least to some degree, and you will be useful to the team in basically any situation, whether you're going up against dreadnoughts or big swarms or during a core stone event. You can basically do something at any given point. So getting into the actual gameplay of the build itself, again, this is a very universal build for the Scout that can be used in many different ways and doesn't necessarily have anything that it can't do at least some amount of good in. This build isn't necessarily a high aggressive build, nor is it a very passive build. It's a very reactionary build, I guess, to a good degree, because you're going to be changing up the way you engage the enemy based on what you're going to be going up against, obviously. Bring the build together, our primary weapon is the Deep Core GK2 assault rifle with its AI stability engine overclock. An overclock that I feel it needs no introduction. This thing is incredibly good at giving you strong single target damage and the ability to hit weak points incredibly well. It is your bread and butter single target weapon for your big threats or just your singular threats that are coming at you in a single file line. And obviously with this, you want to focus on weak points and hitting the enemies where it hurts the most. This is what you're primarily going to be using on your big boys, your things like Praetorians, Oppressors, Dreadnoughts, Wardens, whatever happens. Not to say that you can't use this to deal with the smaller threats as well, but that's more what we have the Bolt Shark for. And with the AI Stability Engine overclock, which we'll go over a little bit more of in the actual gear section of the video, it makes the weapon incredibly easy and forgiving to use, where you don't really need to worry too much about recoil or spread. And for our secondary weapons, we are of course using, as I said, the Nishanka Bolt Shark crossbow, an incredibly fun weapon that has a very satisfying gameplay loop. And to make it even better, we're using the Broadkin bolts overclock. And this gives us the ability to use the Bolt Shark as a strong crowd control tool for dealing with those big groups of enemies. And combining that with the special bolts that we are using for our setup, which in this case is the pheromone bolts, which we'll go over more in detail later, we can mess up the swarm to a really good degree by sowing chaos and making them fight each other before completely messing them up with either a bunch of bolts that we're throwing into or just laying into it with our assault rifle as well. And again, if the assault rifle is what we want to use on the big singular targets, this is what we want to use on those big groups or just smaller threats that don't require a whole lot of effort. And again, you're going to be using both of these weapons all the time, so this is a very good build for people who like to feel as though they're getting the full extent of capabilities out of their setup. So going into the actual setup of the build now, first we of course have our perks. And for this particular build, I'm not going with anything super ridiculously different. It's more or less a very standard perk setup that I've used before. For passives, I chose Resupplier, Born Ready, and Thorns. Resupplier, I don't think I need to say again, but I think it's one of the best passive perks in the entire game. It just helps you stay topped off very consistently and is just really good. Born Ready, in the same vein, it is very useful, especially in a build like this where we are swapping weapons all the time. Even swapping between our equipment can be very useful, and it just helps us stay constantly in the fight without too much downtime. And Thorns, honestly, you could probably swap this out for something else like Elemental Insulation or even Deep Pocket, since we are running Scout, if you want to be the mineral runner for your team. But Thorns is just really good to deal with those very small enemies, which is honestly one of the few things that we don't have a insane way to deal with aside from burning some of our ammo, so that's what I decided to go with. For active perks, I tried a few different setups, and the classic of Iron Will and Dash is of course really good, as it always is, but things like Field Medic or even Beastmaster could be very good as well, and also a lot of fun to add into this particular setup. Now getting into the actual gear setup for the build, first we have our grenade, and for this build there really is no other choice but to use the Voltaic Stun Sweeper, and that's for a couple of different reasons. Number one is it is, at least in my opinion, one of the most fun throwables to use in the entire game. It's very good for wide area control and damage, and for spreading electricity to any enemy that you hit. And secondly, it interacts very heavily with one of our particular mods for our weapons, which we'll go into a little bit more later. And lastly, because the grenade is very forgiving to use, because if you do happen to miss or whiff with it, it will just come back to you so you can use it again later, which is very nice. And ultimately, there's really no other option for this build aside from the Stun Sweeper. You could also potentially use the IFGs, which could provide a similar benefit, but in my practice and in my experimentation, I just felt as though the Stun Sweepers were a little bit more consistent with what we wanted to do. Moving over to the guns themselves, first we have our lovely GK2 assault rifle with its AI stability engine overclock. Again, I don't think I really need to go over the AI stability engine because I'm pretty sure everybody at this point knows what this overclock can do. But in case you've been living under a rock and you do not know, it basically completely takes away the recoil of this weapon and makes the spread for it practically non-existent, and gives a significant damage boost to its weak point damage while lowering its non-weak point damage and lowering its overall rate of fire. So basically it makes the weapon incredibly easy to use and forgiving, while making it a little bit weaker if you're not hitting your shots right. This thing makes it so that way the GK2 is insanely good at taking out those big tough enemies with big glowing weak spots. Talking about oppressors, praetorians, dreadnoughts, wardens, septic spreaders. The list goes on, but this thing makes it so that way the GK2 can take them out really, really easily. Now, the negative drawbacks to the AI stability engine might seem a little bit bad up front, but if you're good at hitting your shots, it really will not feel like too much of a drawback once you get used to it. And to make the gun even better for us, in Tier 1, I took the better rate of fire to help offset the overclock, and also the extra reload speed and better accuracy are kind of redundant with this particular overclock. And then in Tier 2, I went with the extra damage to make the gun even stronger, but you could also go with the extra ammo if you wanted to, if you find yourself missing a lot. In Tier 3, I went with the better magazine capacity, since the extra recoil reduction is completely useless with this overclock equipped. In Tier 4, I chose the better weak point damage just to really lean into that extra weak point damage. And the armor breaking is not really that important because you should not be using this thing unless you are hitting a weak spot anyway. And then lastly, in Tier 5, I chose the rate of fire mod again to even further compensate for the overclock, since the extra stun chance isn't really that important, and Battle Frenzy does not really help us a whole lot with the AI stability engine again as well. All these things make the GK2 with this particular setup feel basically almost like the negative drawbacks from the AI stability engine are non-existent, and that the gun feels almost like its base form, just with sheer upgrades, which again make it very forgiving and easy to use for people who are not super confident with the more intricate scout setups. Next up, for the Nishanka Bull Shark crossbow, again, this is the weapon that we are going to be using for those big swarms, because we're going to be able to bounce our bolts around from one target to the next to be able to deal massive damage and take out the big groups of enemies. In order to achieve that, we need to use the overclock Broadkin bolts, which is where the bulk of our destructive capabilities are going to come from. Basically, this makes it so that way our normal shots, so not the pheromone bolts, are going to be able to ricochet to 2 additional targets, meaning that each bolt can essentially take out 3 enemies if enough are nearby. Now, this does also take away direct damage from the bolts and also makes the reload time significantly longer, but with our particular mod choices, we have the ability to offset that. Now, when talking about the mods, first, I'm actually going to talk about the choice that we took in Tier 5, which is the magnetic shafts. This is where a lot of what makes the particular damage that this weapon can do really shine. Basically, what this does is it makes it so that way the normal bolt will be magnetically drawn to any enemy that is electrified, and also makes it so that way they deal 25% more damage to electrified targets, which brings us back to why we decided to choose the Voltaic Stun Sweepers for this build. We throw the Stun Sweepers into a group of enemies, it bounces between them, dealing damage and also electrifying them, priming them for a shot from the Bolt Shark, which causes the enemies that are hit that are electrified to take an insane amount of damage as a result. This is able to shred through groups of even intermediate type enemies very quickly and easily. The extra damage that they do to electrified targets can take chunks out of Praetorians and even oppressors as well if hit in the right spots. This combination can not only do really good work at just clearing the enemies, but also just slowing them down since you're going to be electrifying so many different things. Now going over the rest of the mods, in Tier 1 we chose the Pheromone Bolts to give us even more crowd control capabilities. This is a really useful one because you can just fire one Pheromone Bolt, biggest thing in the room, and all the rest of the enemies will dogpile onto them to try to take them out, which takes a huge amount of pressure off of your team. You could also shoot a couple of these into the crowd, which will cause enemies to go crazy, as well as group up, which will make it even easier for you to get off the combo of the stun sweepers and the magnetic shafts that we just talked about. Another option you could go with is the taser bolts to help you get the electrification off, but I figured it was a little bit too clunky in my practice to switch back and forth between the special bolts and the normal bolts way too often. Whereas with the Pheromone Bolts, you'll be swapping to them way less often because you're only going to really be doing it when there's a problematic threat that you want to put the pheromones onto. And going through the rest, in the second tier, honestly, the best option is probably the extra bolt damage. But for me, since my aim is not the best, I decided to just go with the increased ammo capacity because I'm not the best at hitting my shots. But honestly, probably the broadhead bolts for extra damage is your better option if you are somebody who is more consistent at hitting their shots. Me personally, though, my accuracy is much to be desired, so that's why I chose the extra ammo capacity. In Tier 3, I went with the faster reload to offset the overclock since you really don't need extra velocity with this particular setup. In Tier 4, I chose the radio transmitter module for similar reasons as to why I chose the ammo capacity in Tier 2, again because I'm not the best at hitting my shots, so this helps me regain those lost shots if I really do miss them. But if you're somebody who's a lot more consistent at hitting their crossbow bolts, the Battle Frenzy is probably a much better option for you. Then going over the equipment for the Scout for this particular setup, for the grappling hook, I went with a very simple setup, which is just extra range in Tiers 1 and 2, the reduced windup time in Tier 3, and fall damage resistance in Tier 4 because I do not do Scout very well. For the flare gun, I also have an incredibly simple setup, which is just extra durations in Tier 1 and 3 and a higher magazine size in Tier 2. And then for the armor rig, I have a slight deviation from the norm of what I normally do. In Tier 1, I'm actually taking deep pockets because I'm the Scout, and I'm going to be getting a lot more minerals, preferably than anybody else. And then, of course, I have healthy in Tier 2 and breathing room in Tier 4. So give me my final thoughts on this build. First, as a non-Scout main, this build was a lot of fun and made me want to play Scout a lot more because, again, as I said in the beginning, it really does take full advantage of every aspect of the Scout's kit. So you are constantly doing new things, constantly changing things up, and the amount of activity that this build provides for you is a lot of fun and really makes playing the Scout feel even more fast-paced than it already kind of is. The fact that you have so many different things at your disposal and can handle essentially anything that comes your way make this build really good for somebody like me who doesn't necessarily know how to put the Scout together too much. Plus you get to use really fun overclocks like AI Stability Engine and Broadkin Bolts, which I don't think anybody's going to complain about. And what's more is the build is not super difficult to get used to, and it doesn't have a very intricate strategy that you need to learn in order to get the most out of its particular gameplay. You just know to use your GK2 for most big targets, and you know to use the crossbow for your more groups of enemies, and yes, there is a little bit of wiggle room in between them, but you learn that as you play the build a lot more. Ultimately, if you're looking for just a fun and active Scout build that will keep you on your feet the entire time, this is a phenomenal build to run. Well, I hope you guys liked this build video. I know for a fact I did because I hadn't done a Scout video in a while, and using this build definitely made me want to use Scout a lot more and to be able to get better with it, and hopefully it's done the same thing to you. If you guys want to see another build for a specific class or using a specific overclock, let me know down in the comments or in the Discord as well. And as always, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please let me know by hitting that like button as it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see, and consider becoming a member today as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.